welcome back to my channel. In today's video we are going to make, I was picturing this being used as like a winter thank you card. So if somebody did something really kind for you during the Christmas season, this would be a good card to give to them. I'm using the Pretty Pine background stamp from Spellbinders, the Big Hugs, Hello something or other from Honeybee. I'll put it down below. And their coordinating dies. And then this is the Feathered Friends or Feathered Cardinal, one or the other, from Tim Holtz and Sizzix. This was actually a promotional item that was gifted to me with a X amount purchase order. And I have yet to use it, and it's pretty cute. So I think we're going to use it on today's card. I have some Recollections Teal cardstock. This is just very thin, and then some white, not only to do our heat embossing, but our stamping on. I have a piece of Christmas foil cardstock from American Crafts. This has some like texture to it. I've had this for probably 10 years, y'all. It is older than dirt. And I just have a little scrap of it. We're going to do some heat embossing, so I have all my heat embossing tools, including my ink. We're going to do some, there's my card base that I've already prepped, and then an envelope. We're going to actually do some fun things with this envelope today. We're going to make a coordinating envelope with our card. I'm going to use the silver embossing powder from Ranger. I usually gravitate to gold, but the silver is quite beautiful. All of the things that I'm going to be die cutting today are small enough that I can use my little Sizzix sidekick. In order to do some jazzing up of our envelope, I'm going to use the Stamp Market Pacific ink to stamp on the flap of that envelope. We're going to do just very generic, very basic coloring. You can use whatever markers you want for this. These are just the ones I have on hand. I think I've got Greystone, Pumpkin Pie, Crimson, Vineyard Berry, and Grapevine for my markers today, my altenew markers. Again, I will put the specific things that I use below because I can't remember them. I've slept, and so I don't remember any of the things. So these are just the altenew markers that I'm going to be using today. But like I said, you could use Crayolas, you could use crayons, you could use whatever. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and die cut out this bird. Now it comes in 5 pieces, and they just layer very easily one on top of the other. And I really used the packaging to let me know how to layer them, but it's pretty self-explanatory. You could figure it out without the packaging. Like I said, this was just a free promotional gift with a so much purchase order amount. And so I would not have probably bought this on my own just because I don't usually gravitate to things like this. But I believe my mother-in-law's favorite bird is a cardinal or red bird, and so I will use it. It's good to have in my stash, just in case I need a card for her. So I have just trimmed that piece of cardstock down so that it'll fit all of these little pieces, and I'm going to run each of these through my little Sizzix sidekick. They go through really easy. This is a thinner weight white cardstock, probably like a 65-pound. So it's not a hefty weight of cardstock. And so they cut super easy, and you really don't need something that is a very heavy weight for this. It's just an embellishment, an accent piece. It's not like holding like the weight of the card, I guess you could say. It's not a functional piece. It doesn't open, it doesn't close, it doesn't wiggle. So it doesn't have to be super heavyweight. So I'm just going to run all of these through, and then we will move on to the next step. So I'm going to choose my sentiment. I'm going to say, "You are made of wonderful." This could be a thank you or an appreciate you, thinking of you, encouragement. You could use this sentiment for just about anything, really. And then I'm going to pick out this dies on the back because Honeybee is fantastic, and his, as far as I can recollect, have always been really good about having coordinating dies with their sentiments, which is fantastic. So I'm going to go through and figure out which sentiment goes with this. And I usually write, when I figure it out, I usually write it on the packaging so that I don't have to do like guess which sentiment goes with what the next time I'm trying to use this particular stamp and die set. I usually just use a ballpoint pen and write it in on the packaging. So I'm just going to go through and die cut these out, and I'm going to use that teal cardstock again. Again, this is a much thinner weight, so you don't need a shim. You don't need to run it through twice. You don't need to do any of the things. If you chose to pop this up, instead of doing itty bitty teeny tiny pieces of foam tape, just die cut this die out multiple times until you get the height that you're looking for. That's a good way to use up scrap cardstock also. So for the bottom layer of the bird, I'm using the darkest red, which is my grapevine, and I am going to color this entire bird and this entire image except for his feet. So his feet actually stick out, and in the packaging, his feet are green. They used a dark green for the bottom layer, the darkest layer. I don't want my bird to have red feet looking like he was walking in blood. And so I am going to end up using that gray that I'm going to use for like the mask of the bird. I'm going to use that on his feet. What I'm doing right now is I'm just using the edge of my marker to go around the edges of this cardstock. Since this is white cardstock, the white edges will show, and to give it a more finished, polished look, if you go around the edges of your die cut with whatever marker you were using or a black marker, it just gives it a more polished and finished look. So now I'm going to use that gray and color in his feet, and I think this is stone or pumice stone or slate gray or something. I don't know. I'll link it below for you. And I'm just going to use that to color his feet and his mask. So I'll try to be better about like raising that up to the camera so that you and I can both see what I'm using, and I don't have to go back and rummage and figure out what I used. So here I am using that gray on his feet, or on his mask, and then I'm going to use that pumpkin on the little triangle piece that is his beak. I'm going to use I think it's crimson on the next darkest layer, which is that bigger part that kind of has some of his head in there. And then on just the feather part, I'm going to use my lightest red, which I think is vineyard berry. So we're going to do that. I'm going to speed up the video here because it's just doing the same thing. I'm going to color in each of these layers with the coordinating marker, getting lighter as I go up from the base of this bird, or from the body of this bird, and go around the edges just to polish it and make it look like it was actually cut from a colored piece of cardstock instead of white. There is the feathers, or his wing, and that is then the lightest color. I thought about adding some sparkle to this with like a glitter pen or a shimmer spritz. I forgot about it by the time I was done with this card, and so, but that would be a really pretty like touch, give him like a frosted glittery look. I'm just going to put this bird together. Like I said, it's pretty easy to put together. I am not very skilled and competent at putting layering dies together. I struggle some, and so this was really easy even for me. So even if you're just new to this, or you're not super comfortable with it, it's still pretty easy. I didn't get his beak lined up quite right, and so I'm just trimming off some of the very bottom layer that was hanging out. So we're going to move on to our heat embossing, and I have a piece of that Teal Recollections cardstock, and I'm going to place this stamp on it. Now this stamp is smaller. I thought it was bigger than it is, but it is not. That card panel, that teal panel there, is A2 size, so it's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. This is probably, I don't know, 3.5 by 5.25 maybe. So it doesn't cover a full A2 size panel. So I had this card arranged and oriented a little bit differently, but because the stamp is smaller, I did have to kind of adapt my layout a little bit, which is fine. It turned out still pretty good. So here I'm using my anti-static powder and my little brush to kind of get this powder all over, because we are going to be doing some heat embossing, and I don't want that embossing powder to go absolutely everywhere. This is a very detailed stamp. There are some very fine lines and fine detail to it. And so I want to make sure that I don't have just an absolute hot mess of embossing powder everywhere. I'm going to use my Versamark ink up this stamp. And I think I stamp it a few times just to get a good and solid impression. I think I missed the middle a little bit when I stamped it. But we're just going to stamp this out a couple times and then pour on our embossing powder. And we will do the same thing for our sentiment as well. So we're going to pour on that silver embossing powder from Ranger. This is a really pretty silver. Sometimes silvers can be kind of on the cooler side or the warmer side. This is just a really pretty, like, I guess for lack of better words, neutral silver, and it looks really pretty on this cardstock. Like I said, I usually gravitate toward gold, but I was inspired by something I'd seen on Pinterest, and so I wanted to try the silver. I just thought that would be something new for me, and so I decided to go with that. I am going to funnel all of this embossing powder back into the pot just because I'm a klutz and I don't want to knock this all over the place, because I'll be picking embossing powder up for weeks, kind of like glitter. And so I do put it away even though I'm not really done with it yet. I'm going to pull out my little mini Misty, and I'm going to line up these 2 little die cuts on this little sticky mat, which I do end up replacing after this video. It is not sticky whatsoever anymore. It was kind of useless. And so I am going to just line up these sentiments with their coordinating die cut. And I have never used these before, so I'm just rubbing my fingers on them to just kind of season them a little bit so they accept the Versamark ink a little better. So I'm just going to get these lined up, and then we will do the same thing. We'll pour on our embossing powder and get them heat set. I've had my heat gun heating off to the side for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then I'm going to use my tweezers because I do not want to burn the absolute fire out of my fingers. I'm going to use my tweezers to kind of hold particularly these little bitty guys. I think I use it with the big background stamp also, but I definitely use it for these little bitty guys and heat set them. And we will heat set the background also. You can really see this embossing powder set as it melts and gets heat set. It's really pretty. It just turns from like this grainy kind of unfantastic image to a beautiful silver shiny awesomeness. I love watching embossing powder heat set. I did take my little Swiffer cloths and just buff off the rest of that embossing anti-static powder. And then I did take my paper trimmer and trim this down a little bit just to get off the excess excess cardstock that didn't have any imaging on it, any of that embossing on it. Here I'm just playing with my layout. I figured out that this is not going to fit this panel very well, and so I'm kind of playing with my layout a little bit. I thought about doing it landscape like this, but I felt like my bird was just floating. I didn't feel like there was any grounding for him. This is totally an option though. It still looks pretty, and I really don't think that somebody's going to look at your card. Your recipient is going to look at your card and be like, this bird is totally floating in space. That looks terrible. They're not going to care. But as far as for me, I cared. It bothered me. So I am going to flip the orientation of this card. I'm just going to glue this background panel on there onto this card base. It did warp some, excuse me, it did warp some just because that is a lot of heat that we applied to a pretty thin piece of cardstock. So I'm just going to align this as best I can and I can always go back and trim off the excess. So here is that American Crafts Christmas foil. I'm pretty positive that this is not available. Like I've said, I've had this for probably 10 years or more, and but there are similar ones. You could even use a glitter cardstock. You could even just heat emboss a scrap piece of cardstock with that same silver embossing powder and have something that matches absolute perfect with your embossing. So I'm just slipping a little bit of glue underneath this, and then I'm going to lay something heavy on it and let all of this set, and we'll eventually go back and trim off this excess paper. So we're going to work on a coordinating envelope now. I'm just going to stamp on the panel, on the flap of this envelope. And I have cleaned my background stamp, and I have positioned it in my little stamp positioning tool here. And I have slipped a piece of scrap cardstock. That was the cardstock that we used when we were coloring our cardinal. I just slipped a piece of scrap cardstock to protect the back of the envelope, just so that when we stamp, we are only stamping on top of that flap. This is where that Pacific ink from Stamp Market is going to come into play. I thought that was a really pretty close match to my cardstock, that teal cardstock. And so we're just going to stamp a section of this on this envelope. It doesn't cover the entire envelope, so I'm going to eventually have to clean this stamp off and reposition this again so that I can get a stamping across the entire of this flap of this envelope. So here I have repositioned that stamp and that envelope in my stamp positioning tool just so that I can get that little probably 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch section that didn't stamp. Did this stamp perfectly? No, it did not, but it is the back of the card envelope, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And I actually think kind of that missed stamping, I guess you could say, almost gives it kind of a distressed look, which actually looks pretty good with this particular stamp. So here we have the entire flap of this envelope stamped, and it is all done. And I think that looks really cool. I quite often forget the envelope, and it kind of comes as an afterthought, but I felt like this really needed something on the envelope as kind of an unexpected surprise. So here I've let that all set, and I'm just going to go back and trim off this excess cardstock that's hanging over. You could absolutely keep this little section. You could attach it to the inside of the card. I just opted to put mine in the trash. Don't yell at me. I can't stand a whole bunch of like scraps everywhere. It just seems like clutter to me. So I'm just trimming that off, and then we will begin to kind of get this card all put together. Like I said, I felt like the original layout I had planned, the bird was just floating in nowhere. And it is a bird, so, excuse me, it could float and just be flying in space. But I felt like it needed to be grounded. And so I chose to flip this orientation from landscape to portrait. And we're going to glue everything together just like this. I was trying to see how I have my camera set up. I was trying to see how this was looking. This is another option. This is how I intended it to go. But again, I just felt like that bird was floating in nowhere. And I didn't particularly care for that. It still looks pretty. And like I said, your recipient is not going to sit there and be judging your card. They're going to be so grateful that you thought of them. And so if you like it this way, go for it. It's your card, your creation, you do you. But I did choose to flip mine portrait instead of landscape. I chose to pop up the bird with some foam tape. This is Instant Dimension foam tape from Altenew. And I chose to pop up the bird, give it just a little bit of elevation from the cardstock. I do end up gluing the sentiment down flat. But again, if you wanted to have more dimension with this card, you could, and dimension with the sentiment, instead of cutting itty bitty tiny strips of this foam tape, you could just cut out the die multiple times and glue it together, and that would give you some dimension, and that would give you a little more sturdiness than this foam tape. I did not put slivers of foam tape on his feet. I'm not going to punish myself that way, but you absolutely could if you wanted to. Or you could always, because you have that die, you could always cut the die out multiple times if you wanted more dimension behind that bird. So now everything is glued down, and I am using these embellishments that I got from Blinky Thingy on Etsy. This is an embellishment pack, and I have picked out the ones that I thought worked the best. These are just some like teal faceted gems. There's no like iridescence or anything to them. And I am just going to glue those down, and then this card is complete. So thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you. I hope you had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and that you were inspired. If you were and you liked this video, please subscribe and hit that bell icon so that you are notified each time I post a new video. Until then, we will see you next time, and thank you so much for watching.